capture the information that we're reviewing in our classes for future reference, I guess I'd say, and some of you have asked for copies of this information. I appreciate that. That's a compliment to me. It's really a compliment to the Word of God, because God's the one that left this record for us, and I'm just trying to review some of it in order as best I can to help you to understand the Bible story. The Bible has so many good stories, and most of us have studied the stories, but we have not been able to successfully hook all these stories together in an ongoing story of the history of the people of mankind. And God has had an ongoing relationship with mankind from the very beginning, and His relationship continues through time. And so I'm trying to review this with you so that you can understand in a chronological way all of these stories and how they go together and how they interact. And though you understand there's so many stories and so much going on that I cannot possibly, with the time that we have here, give all the details, nor am I capable of doing that. But I want to give you the major stories and give you the major dates that mark each one of the segments of the human history, and help you to understand how that God has dealt with mankind from the very beginning. We've already had 3 class sessions on this, and I want to again remind you that I will be using some times and dates that may be questionable, and you feel free to adjust those to your own liking. I will try to give you the approximate dates, and in fact I will be very specific on the ones I give, because I think I have studied this through pretty well, and it can very well give you Bible references over time to prove out the dates that I give you. However, scholars and different people over time have disagreed within 100 to 2 years of some of these dates, and so I don't have any issue with them, and we'll ask you to just give me the same liberties that anybody else has to have when you deal with these kind of times and dates. Also remember that I'd like to ask you to give me a little liberty, because I'm not using notes. I'm giving this information from my memory as best I can, and so if I miss it a little bit, don't write me off as a total loss. I'll get back on track
anyway.
over time. Today we want to continue with our story that we have started several weeks ago, and we will be dealing with a time frame which involves the period from 1491 BC for the next 396 years. And that is the time when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, when the Exodus occurred. They came out of slavery and then went through the wilderness wanderings for a period of about 39 and a half years, almost 40 years by the time they got to Canaan. And then they went into the land of Canaan under the leadership of Joshua. And this period of time occurred, as we say, about 396 years from the Exodus out of Egypt to the beginning of the kingdom, when the kings began to rule in the land of Canaan. And that first king, as you know, was Saul. The next was David, and the third king in the United Kingdom was called Solomon. And we will start with our study of that next week. Today we want to deal specifically with the events occurring after the crossing of the Red Sea, when Moses led the children of Israel into the wilderness, and there to adapt themselves into a community living style that was not necessarily making them happy, but at least it kept them alive, and they survived during the period of 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. After the crossing of the Red Sea, it took the Israelites about 3 months to get down from the crossing of the Red Sea, and from Rephidim, from Marah, from Elim, and the other short stops they made down to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai was a major stop for the children of Israel because it is that point that they were led by Moses, who was at that time 80 years old when he came out of the land of Midian to go to Egypt, and then brought the children of Israel out of Egypt into the wilderness. And so he was strong and robust and well prepared to lead the children of Israel, because he had spent 40 years in Egypt under the rulership of the Pharaohs, and learned all the customs and languages of the people that made him capable of bringing the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. So they got to Mount Sinai, and major things happened there, because God had told Moses, I want you to come up into the mountain, Mount Sinai. And we might pause here to say, well, where was Mount Sinai? It was somewhere in the desert of Paran, and time called the Desert of Sin, or the Wilderness of Sin, and which was between Egypt and the land of Midian, which was on the eastern side of the land of Paran. And Mount Sinai was somewhere in that area. Some have put it even further east, and the reason for that, they said this was a volcano, and there were no volcanoes of record in any historical period in the wilderness of Paran. So it would have had to been in the land of Moab, and that's many miles east, and probably was not the case. So we attribute the events of Mount Sinai to be divinely directed, and so that the events that occurred when Moses went into the mountain was not necessarily a natural event of volcanic eruption or that kind of thing, but the events of Mount Sinai when it had an earthquake, and when the power of God came down and the land smoked, and there was thunderings and lightnings and things that accompanied the presence of God, that this was a divine event, very miraculously done by God. And when Moses was called up in the mountain, there was no accidental volcanic reaction here, that it was designed by God to get the attention of the children of Israel and to further indoctrinate them with the will to want to worship and serve God. And so God told Moses, he said, you put a boundary around the mountain, and so that nobody but the people I say can come into the mountain. And if they even touch the mountain, they're going to die. And so Moses put boundaries around the Mount Sinai and marked it off so that the people would not infringe on the coming of God down on the mountain when God came to reveal to Moses the events of the law. So people washed their clothes and purified themselves and got ready for the coming of God down on Mount Sinai. And when he came down, it was an awesome, awesome experience. Very fearful for the children of Israel, and they were very afraid of the presence of God as he presented himself on the mountain. Well, God told Moses to come up into the mountain, and he would give him the law. God had written the law on 2 tablets of stone, and apparently he had written with his own finger, which would have been a very, very monumentous occasion to be able to see that writing. Unfortunately, that was not preserved because of the events that took place after Moses came out of the mountain. But Moses went into the mountain, and God met with him in the cloud, apparently not visually face to face. Nevertheless, God and Moses knew each other face to face, as the book of Numbers records. When Moses came down out of the mountain, he brought the law, the 10 Commandments, and the other laws that were adjacent to or connected with the children of Israel's needs. They had a need for a civil law because they had been in slavery for somewhere between 200 and 430 years. And God had promised Abraham that they would be in Egypt for 430 years, and We don't know how long a period of time that they were in the slavery period of their existence, but it was a long time. So they had no civil law, they had no religious law, and they had no moral law, because they were living under the moral statutes of the Egyptian people, which was not a very highly recommended moral law, and as many of you may already know. So when Moses came out of the mountain, he brought those laws down with him, and he got down to the base of the mountain, and only to find that already the children of Israel had gone off into idolatry. They had taken the gold that they brought out of Egypt and made a golden calf out of it, and were worshiping this calf. Moses was so infuriated with their behavior until he threw the tablets of stone down and destroyed them as he cast them down. And he also was so upset with the children of Israel for serving a golden image until he took the golden calf, he ground it into powder, and made them drink it in their water. And they consumed their own God in their own matter of consumption, drinking it in their water. And that taught them a lesson, but it was not one that prevailed for very long. Well, God called Moses back into the mountain and continued to give him the law. And this time he carried some people with him. He carried Aaron and some of the elders of the children of Israel, and he had lunch with them, or a meal with them. They ate together with God. And that's recorded there in the book of Exodus, as you can read. And God gave the extent of the law, which included the building of the tabernacle, which was a tent. It was a portable tent, one that could be moved around, and this was a building, though portable, where God could come and commune with the people and speak to the people. And he had a room in the tabernacle that he dwelled in. And it was his special room, and he would not permit anybody to go in except only once a year. The high priest could go in to check over the room and the contents of it, and then he had to get back out because God himself lived there. Now, inside the tabernacle, as the instructions that God gave Moses proved to be, was a two-room building that was covered by a curtain of animal skins. And we won't go into detail of all the dimensions and everything, but the first place you got into the tabernacle was called the holy place. And it contained the 3 pieces of furniture. It contained the table of incense, the lampstand, and the table of showbread. And there was a curtain between the holy place and the most holy place, which was 10 cubits cubed, 10 cubits one way, the other way, and 10 cubits high. And that's where God had his abode, and he had commanded that they build the ark, which we call the Ark of the Covenant. And it had an opening in it. It was a box that they could put things inside. And they had 3 things contained in the Ark of the Covenant. It was a pot of manna that they saved from their manna that God fed them in the 40 years they were in the wilderness. It was also the 10 Commandment tablets that were in the ark, and then the rod of Aaron that budded. Now, a rod was just a stick that the shepherds carried around to help lead their sheep, but in this case, the rod of Aaron budded when he used it before the magicians in Egypt, before Pharaoh. And so that was preserved in the ark. Those 3 things were in the ark, and the ark was closed down, and that was checked out every year as the high priest went in. Then there was a special place that God dwelled in the holy place, and that was in the area of the mercy seat. That was the place right under where the cherubims on each end of the ark were placed and had their wings stretched forth across the ark, and that mercy seat was under the wings of the angels, or the cherubims. And that's where God came, and that's where he spoke to the high priest and to Moses, and from that location is where God gave his directions from time to time. Well, the laws that God gave Moses to pass on to the children of Israel were many, many laws that were very burdensome, and yet God expected the children of Israel to keep them. And the major ingredient of the law was involving animal sacrifice. They were given the instructions to make sacrifice for many things that they did from day to day and from month to month and from year to year. And among those were peace offerings, meal offerings, sin offerings, and they had specific instructions of how they were to do that. And the tribe of Levi, which came from Aaron, were given the instructions of tending to the religious acts of the children of Israel, and they were while they were a tribe of Jacob, they were not a possessive tribe of lands, but they did have cities that God gave them. But the Levites were one that took care of the ark, took care of the tabernacle, and took care of the movement of the tabernacle when they moved from time to time. Many things happened along that way. We won't have time to go into detail on the worship of the children of Israel, the animal sacrifices, but we would like to say that you remember that God led the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt by a cloud during the daytime, and then at night there was a pillar of fire. And this pillar of fire obviously cast off light. And so God led the children of Israel from place to place by moving his cloud during the daytime or the pillar of fire at night. And over the course of the next 40 years, from Mount Sinai to the entrance into the land of Canaan, the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle were taken and moved by the Levite tribe, by the Levitical priesthood tribe, and that tabernacle was disassembled. It was a portable building. It was made by planks and staves and sockets and rings that held it together, and then it was covered by 4 layers of animal skins and tapestry on the inside. But it was taken apart, folded up, baggaged up, and moved about 31 times. And you will find that not numbered like that, but you will find the mention of the different camps that the children of Israel moved in that 40-year period. About 31 times was the movement. So the Levitical priesthood and the tribe of that came after Aaron and the tribe of Levi had a lot to do. And they had 3 different families that administered to each part of the movement of the tabernacle. And you can study that in the book of Exodus, and it's pretty exciting how they moved that tabernacle. Well, finally, after a period of time, the children of Israel, of course, they murmured many times. I think there are about 10 different murmurings that the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against God for their conditions in the wilderness. And they were given water to drink. We saw that from our study last time, and how that Moses struck the rock at Rephidim and water came forth. And we also mentioned it took an immense amount of water because coming out of Egypt, there were 603,550 fighting soldiers, men of fighting age that came out, and that number crossed the Red Sea. Well, if you multiply that you would normally use for the old men, old women, for the children, for the underage people that came along with that 603,000 people, you would come up with about 3 million people. 2.5 to 3.5 million people came across the Red Sea and into the wilderness. A tremendous number of people that had to be fed had to be watered every single day. Well, last time we talked, I mentioned one of the suppositions that we can put in our mind. In order to have enough water to water that many people in a day, in our modern illustration, we would say it would take enough train cars with tankers on it that would go for a distance of about 50 miles. So if you can imagine a train all the way from where we are for 50 miles out, they had to have a train of tank cars loaded with water every day. So a lot of water had to come out of the rock of Rephidim. And that water was a continuous need, so when they traveled from place to place, they had to find springs or water being provided. Water was again provided in a miraculous way. And this is recorded in the 20th chapter of the book of Numbers. And the people got out of water, and they cried hard against Moses, and Moses then provided water for them. He and Aaron, and he made a major mistake there when he provided that water, because the second time he came to the rock, which he came first time at Rephidim, he came again, and this time he spoke to the rock and struck it with his rod and made the statement, "See ye here, rebels, we do bring forth water." And we was Moses and Aaron. And God didn't take kindly to that, because they took credit for the water that came out of the rock the second time that Moses had given water out of the rock. And so God put a little penalty on Moses, maybe a great penalty. But he told Moses, he said, "You cannot go into the promised land because you did not give me the credit for the miracle of the water." And also joining him was Aaron. Now Aaron was Moses' brother, and he was 3 years older than Moses. And so by this time, soon after that, God told Aaron to go up into Mount Horeb. And he did, and when he did, he died in Mount Horeb at 123 years old. His sister, Miriam, which was also a tremendous leader of the women from that children of Israel group, also died very close to the time frame that Aaron died, and she was buried there in the wilderness. Moses lived a few months later, not very long later, we don't know how long exactly, but we know that it was within the same year, because Moses died at 120 years old, and he was 3 years younger than Aaron, his brother, who had died at 123. So they both died the same year. But Moses was able to go with the children of Israel a little further than Mount Horeb, up toward the land of Canaan, and he went up to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, where Moses died, and God buried him there in the valley of Pisgah. And Moses got to see the promised land from the top of Nebo, and looked over the lands of the southern part of the land of Judah, and as far north as he could see from Pisgah. Obviously could not see the northern end of the land of Canaan, but he got to view the country that the children of Israel were going to get to go into, and he nevertheless failed to go in himself. Now, at this time, they had been in the wilderness for about 39 and a half years, and they came up to Kadesh Barnea, and Moses requested from the Edomites that they might go through their land. He said, "Now, we won't bother anything. We won't take anything from the land. We won't, if we get any of your water, we'll pay you for it, but we've got to go past your land to get to the land of Canaan." And that's where we're going. And Kadesh Barnea was down past the southern end of the Dead Sea, so they had a few miles yet to go to get to the land of Canaan. But the Edomites said, "No way, Jose, you do not cross through our country." And then there were the Moabites, and Moses questioned them, and they said, "Nope, you can't come through here." Well, the Edomites and the Moabites and the Ammonites were the three nations or tribal groups of people that were between Kadesh Barnea in the wilderness and the land of Canaan, which they were headed to. So somebody had to give. And the thought that Moses had was that we don't want to kill these people or fight them because they're our brethren. And let's back up just a little bit. You remember that the Edomites were the children of Esau. And there was also a splinter group off of the Edomites. And this was one of the grandsons of Esau. His name was Eliphaz. And he had a son named Amalek. And Amalek was the parent of the Amalekite nation. Well, that's significant because you recall a little bit later in the story how that the Amalekites resisted the children of Israel. In fact, the Amalekites fought against Moses down at Rephidim when they had water coming from the rock of Rephidim. And Moses whipped them. But they didn't stay whipped. They were still very vocal, and they would not let the children of Israel go through their country. They were right at the southern end of the land of Canaan. And so the Amalekites wouldn't permit passage. The Edomites, who were the children of Esau, would not permit passage. The Moabites, which were the children of the incestuous son of Lot when he escaped out of Sodom, he had a son by both of his daughters, one each. One was named Ammon and the other was named Moab. Well, Moab was the father of the Moabite nation, so Moses didn't want to fight them. And then there were the Ammonites. They were on the east side of the river of Jordan up close to Jericho. And so Moses had to get passage somehow or another. And so after he died, Joshua took over and he dealt with it and he took care of the situation. He just went up and fought Ammon and defeated the Ammonites and went on into Jericho. As you recall the story, crossing the Jordan River on dry ground, like they did at the Dead Sea. So these people that were all relatives of Israel, which we have just seen, they hated to fight them, but they had to get to the land of Canaan. And these people were very protective of their territory, and because of the battles that Israel had under Joshua, they had to move around some and give room for these 3 million people to come in out of the desert and go into the land of Canaan. Well, the next period of time occurred when Joshua took over the leadership of the children of Israel from Moses, and for the next 50 years, Joshua led the children of Israel to the west across the Jordan. He went past Jericho, and you know what happened at the walls of Jericho? They fell down, and Israel conquered Jericho. They went on up through the valley to the north, and Ai was in the way, so they fought against Ai. They lost the initial battle because Achan had sinned in the camp of Israel and taken some of the spoils out of Jericho that were forbidden by God to do. And so they lost Ai, but then after they repented, they went back up there the second time and won in the battle of Ai. And so Joshua began his conquest of the land of Canaan. Joshua worked on that for about 50 years. And his cohort, Caleb, also worked on that. And Joshua and Caleb were given the task of dividing the land up into different tribes and to different people and settling the people of Israel into the land of Canaan, which was already in production. They had their fields and their vineyards and their houses and villages and walled cities and so forth. And so Joshua and Caleb led in that conquering of Israel. There's some other interesting stories like the spies that went out of the wilderness into the land of Canaan, the stories they brought back. The story of Rahab when spies came to spy out Jericho before the Israelites came into the city of Jericho, and how that she was saved because she protected the spies, and just very interesting stories along that line. We won't have time to get them all. The next period of time that we see in the Jewish history was the period of time after Joshua. The scripture says in the last part of the book of Joshua that after Joshua died and after the leaders or the elders of the families that ruled after Joshua, they died, then they had no leadership in Israel. And the scripture says they did that which was right in their own eyes. Well, that meant without leadership and without people protecting them, their enemies, which I've just mentioned several of them, and there are many more, including the Philistines, they came in and plagued Israel for about 250 to 300 years. And God raised up judges to be leaders of the people to fight against the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Amalekites, the Philistines, and just one nation after another came against Israel. So we had 15 judges that took the leadership to fight against these opposing nations. I don't know whether I could name them or not, but I'll try. There was Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, and Gideon. Deborah was a woman judge, and Gideon was the man that fought against the Midianites, a great nation of people, and he won by using tactics that are very unusual in battle. And so after Gideon, you had Abimelech, Tola, Jared, Jephthah, Ibzan, Abdon, Elon, Samson, Eli, and Samuel. Well, I left out one, Abdon, but we got most of them. Anyway, notable in this, and our time is going to get us here, but Samson was one of the notable judges, and along with events of the other judges, which you can read from the book of Judges, Samson was raised up by God to fight against the Philistine people. The Philistines were a powerful people. They maintained their power. They were very vicious warriors. And as you recall, they were children of Nimrod, the mighty hunter, which lived about 2300, 2250 BC. And so they became the sea people. They became what was known as the sea people. And they lived along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. They were also the parent people of the Phoenicians, which we read about later, that really became the leaders in the trade routes all over the Mediterranean Sea and became a powerful and stayed a powerful nation. And they are still a people to be reckoned with. It was after them that the land of Canaan was named Palestine, after the Philistine people. And many of those Palestinians were giant people, from which Goliath came from the city of Gath. The Philistines had Gaza, Ashdod, Elon, and Gath as their major cities down in the southwestern part of the land of Canaan. So all of these judges came into being to rule the people of God as best they could. And the last one of those, last two of those actually, were Eli and then Samuel, the great and mighty prophet of God, and he was a great leader. And he's the one that anointed the next king, or the first king of Israel, which was Saul. And we'll talk about that in our next session together. The beginning of the kingship of Saul and David and Solomon, and then later the divided kingdom and the many kings that came under that kingdom. Are there any questions real quick?
I have a question here. You know, you talk about these periods of Jewish history. There were three distinct eras there. You know, you had of course, your patriarchal period, which you talked about, and then you had the period of the law, which comes in now, Jewish people. With Moses, the transitional, was that the last of the patriarchal? Got the transition from the old patriarch where God communicated through with man, with a direct communication with man, with Moses or Joshua, the kind of the cutoff area, or the transitional area, as you say.
Well,
because then it went from, like you said, from Moses to and God instituted the judges, and then the kings came, and then they lived under the law then, right? Is that right?
Right. The law was given about 3 months after Moses came out of the land of Egypt with the children of Israel. And then there was a period of about 396 years between the Exodus out of Egypt and the beginning of the kingdom, which Saul was the first king. So 396 years, and Moses was the prophet of God and the leader of God, and then he was succeeded by Joshua, who was more of a general who led the people to conquest in Canaan. And then the judges ruled the people, but they did not rule them united. They were just territorial rulers of various periods of time, and some of their periods of time were contemporary with each other. So the next division we have is when Samuel, which was a prophet of God and a high priest of God, a priest of God, when he ruled and established the first king, which was Saul. This did not end the speaking to the patriarchs necessarily, because God spoke to David and to Solomon and to Saul. I should have mentioned that first. And then there were many prophets of God that continued to voice God's message to the people. And that continued on down through the end of the captivity, because you have, during the captivity, 2 major prophets. You have Ezekiel and Daniel, and they gave the message of God to mankind. So there was an ongoing dialogue of God through the prophets, very much like Moses was, all the way down to the end of the Old Testament era.
Yeah, but you said earlier, to start out, that, there was a period that they didn't have a law or more code to live under. What was the transitional period, in your opinion?
Okay,
Where
they had the law.
Under the judges or the kings, or where?
They had the law, but the people did not regard the law. They quit worshiping the law, and they did that which is right in their own eyes. The last chapter, chapter 24 of Joshua, and they had a very unorganized period of time under no specific leader. So under the period of the judges, they just did what they wanted to, and God punished them because they went into idolatry most of that time. But as far as being under one leader, they were not. Even the leaders of the judges, which God ordained for them to have, they were not necessarily obedient to what the judges did, nor did the judges do for the whole country what they would do in some specific area. And so there was really, it was just an apostasy from the law of Moses during the period of the judges. They did not keep the law. They did not keep the Passover. There was a period of about 400 years when Josiah became king, which was during the divided kingdom, that they had not even kept the Passover. They didn't even know about the Passover. And that was a very important part of God's will to the period of the children of Israel in Egypt. And, in the wilderness under Moses. So they just, religiously, the children of Israel just rode off into the sunset. That's the way to put it. They just disintegrated as a nation under the period of the judges. Then the kings came in and began to put them back together again. It might be noted that under Abimelech, which was one of the judges, he tried to make a king rulership out of his kingdom, but he died and failed to get it together, so it never happened until Saul's day, when Samuel anointed Saul as king.
Let's drive the stake down right there.
We'll drive it down, and
I think next week Bill Pogue is going to have a class.
Does that record audio too?
We're going to come back. He said 2 weeks, but we might squeak some more out of it.
well, I'm going to be out of gas, I'm afraid.
I can understand why people had to leave.